Hello and welcome to the Washington Institute. I'm Rob Satloff, the director of the Institute, and I'm very happy that you could join us for the first in a series of special events that we're hosting today, tomorrow, and the following day on Thursday, all in commemoration of the 50th anniversary of one of the most seismic, consequential events to affect the Middle East in modern times. Recently, the American National Security Advisor gave a talk in which he extolled the moment of calm that we're having in the Middle East right now and the de-escalation of pressures that we see across the region. Well, that's not so much unlike the way the world thought the Middle East was in the summer and early fall of 1973. But then everything changed with the surprise decision by the president of Egypt and his partner in Syria to launch an attack against Israel and to change the regional dynamic, eventually unleashing not just war, but unleashing the forces of peacemaking. And the Middle East has never been the same since. Today, tomorrow, and Thursday, we are going to be looking at what happened then and the legacy of the October 1973 war for policymaking and leaders up till today. Today, we're delighted to be able to focus on the events of the war itself and its implications for Egypt, Israel, and the United States. Tomorrow, we have a program that is looking at the issue of strategic surprise and what leaders need to be prepared for today, if they are to be better prepared today than leaders may have been 50 years ago. And on Thursday, we're going to look at the issue of the influence and power of energy exporters, remembering that in 1973, what brought home the reality of Middle East war to millions of Americans was the oil boycott by many Middle East oil exporters. Is that possible again today? Or how has the energy markets changed in such a way to make it no longer a threat to energy resources? That's the program for the next 3 days. But today, we're opening our session with a very special few moments with Anwar E. Sadat. I'm delighted to welcome Anwar Sadat, a friend of mine, a former member of the Egyptian parliament, head of the Reform and Development Party in Egypt, and for today's purposes, a very special guest because he bears the name and is the nephew of President Anwar Sadat, the man of decision who launched the October War 50 years ago. Anwar, welcome to the Washington Institute. I'm delighted that you could be with us from Cairo. Anwar, I wanted to open this 3-day event by having a brief exchange with you about the person, about President Sadat, a person you know from your family, served as president from 1970 to his assassination in 1981, a remarkably eventful 11 years in the history of Egypt, in the history of the Middle East. But tell us a bit about the man who made the decision. Anwar.
Well, thank you, Rob. Thank you for inviting me in this very special event. I would like to say hello to everyone who is following us. I would say simply, the late President Sadat was someone who is very devoted to his, let's say, background as a farmer, devoted to his family, and he was the only, I would say, politician, let's say, among all those young officers whom they have been carrying out these revolutions in 1952. He was imprisoned in the 40s, late 40s. So he suffered, and he knows what he was really up to. Of course, when he took over in 1970, Egypt was in a very, very bad situation. We have a defeat in 67. Even with all this war of attrition, which have been going on from 67 until 73, there was success stories from both sides, but it was not an open war. Actually, he believes in peace, and he was reading history very well, and he knows what happened in the First World War and the Second World War, and he knows that people cannot fight forever. Peace has to come. So he believed in this, and actually he was in this 70s when he took over, he was under severe pressure from student unions, universities, and also people were asking him that something has to be done, a revenge. We have to get our land back. At that time, of course, there was some centers of powers from the Nasser era. And they were actually controlling everything: Ministry of Defense, Interior, the information, media, everything. So he managed, by stupid move from them, to have full control, and he started to rebuild our armed forces. The first thing he did was getting rid of all Russian experts. Although at that time we have this special treaty with, strategic treaty with Russia, but he said, this is our war and we will do it. If we will have to do it, we will do it ourselves. So no one believed that he will manage to take such a decision. They thought that he's too weak, but he was smart enough by bringing back most of those professionals, good officers who have been fired or sacked during Nasser time. He bring them back. They start to organize themselves. They start to have a good training, and they start to select a very, let's say, well-educated young soldiers, officers. So he managed to make a kind of reconciliations by all those who have been jailed, whether they were representing liberals, right, lefts, Islamists. He opened doors for all of them, and he said, this is our, let's say, fight. We all has to fight together, so we have to bring all Egyptians together. And parallel to this, actually, he was sending also through diplomatic messages, through envoys, special envoys, to the states, some European countries, to try to test the water and see if there is a chance for peace based on the UN resolutions, and that Israel would withdraw from lands which have been occupied in 67. All the messages he got back actually was, nothing we can do as long as the situation is as is. This stagnation, nothing we can do. Unless something happened on the ground, we cannot step in. This was especially from Secretary Kissinger. Very clear message. So he said, well, then there is no choice, but we have to do something. So actually, when he took the decision, his executive order to the armed forces, it was all about crossing the canal to the other side and maybe go for 10, 15 kilometers and hold on your position, because he believed that negotiations and peace will come. This is what he had in mind, because some, stupid, let's say Nasserist, or they say, well, he should have continued to Tel Aviv, which is crazy. And he knows his limits, he knows his capabilities, and he knows that Israel will get this bridges of supports from all kind of equipment, arms, and he doesn't want to risk his troops. So all what he had in mind, it was all about peace. And this is what even he said, we are fighting for peace, because he believes in this.
Anwar, your namesake, President Sadat, launched this war and eventually went to Jerusalem, made peace with Israel. How is he remembered in Egypt today? For 73, for 77, for 81? How is he remembered in Egypt today?
Well, honestly, for 73, this is the only war, I would say, that Egypt have won since 1948. This is the only war Egypt have won. So it's very much welcome, appreciated by most of Egyptians. We always celebrate this during Mubarak, even now during Sisi. This is the only victory we have. So he is actually the one who's always on top of this, because he is the man who have took the decision, and he was actually completely spending all his time, the first 2 weeks, with the headquarters in the army, with his head of departments, and he even moved from his house to another small villa, small house called El Qasr El Tahra in Roxy, in Heliopolis, just to be close to this headquarters of the army. So he had been very much involved, and actually he was completely isolated even from the family. Only his wife, from time to time, she passed by him just to make sure that he's okay, because also she was busy going around visiting hospitals, all those who are wounded and so on. So I think what he did, it was honestly, Yani, and what our army and the people behind it was American. And it was all about peace. It was all about that if you need to sit and negotiate, something has to happen. And this is actually what he did, because some people have been criticizing him that he should have continued. Some of those whom we call the fauteuil generals, or generals who are sitting in nice sofas, which nothing they can do except they are just giving any kind of philosophical things, which is nonsense, you know. So no, I think he managed to do it. And as I said, his executive order was clear that he want to cross the canal, go in 10, 15 kilometers, hold on positions, because he knows that he cannot carry on, and he will not risk to lose his, let's say, officers or soldiers. And he doesn't have this capability. He knows his limit. And this is something, Yani President Sadat was not one of those leaders whom they deliver big speeches and threatening here and there, but when it comes to action, they cannot deliver. He's not that style, honestly. And we in the Arab world in general, we are known to be the one who speak very, strong words, but not and missing opportunities by what we usually try to do. So I think saying this, I don't mean that President Sadat was an engine. No, after all, he is a human being, and even if there is shortcomings, but still, to be fair, we have to give him this, let's say, appreciations that what he did have really, in a way, make a real shift, big shift in the regional dynamics. And by time, I think people start to realize that he was right and that he have a vision. And this is what we are seeing today. Everyone now is trying to imitate or to try to do what they miss in the 70s, you know. So I think no, people by time now, they all realize that he was right and that he have this courage to take such a step and going to Jerusalem and speak in the Knesset. And I keep on listening to his speech in the Knesset, which was very strong. And I think what I have seen from some Israelis that they see him as a prophet for peace or as a man of peace. They really value what he did because this is what he was all about. And if I would say, if you see what is written in his wrist place, in the stone top, in his wrist place, that he is a man who lived for peace and he died for principles. This is President Sadat in a very simple words.
Anwar Sadat, thank you very much for joining us to offer this this snapshot of your namesake, President Anwar Sadat. Thank you for joining us from Cairo. With that, I'm going to turn the rest of this program over to my colleague, David Makovsky. David, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Rob, and thank you very much, Mr. Sadat. Inspiring to hear your words. We have an all-star panel here today to discuss 73 and its aftermath and to kick off this three-part series that Rob just referred to. Three people very prominent, not just in their own countries, but beyond, and people who are very knowledgeable about 73. So I'll start by just saying a couple sentences about each. There's so much we could say about each one of these. Ephraim Halevi has been a senior Israeli intel expert and diplomat. He served as the head of the Mossad between 1998 and 2002, and as the head of the Israeli National Security Council between 2002 and 2003. He served as Israel's ambassador to the EU and is known for his role in bringing about the landmark Israel-Jordan peace treaty of 1994. And it should be said that during the 1973 war, Ephraim served as the Mossad station chief in Washington, very much at the nexus of relations between the United States and Israel. Abdulmunim Said Ali, also very prominent figure in Egypt, the director of the Regional Center for Strategic Studies in Cairo. He was the head of the Al-Ahram Center. He's a senior fellow at the Crown Center for Middle East Studies at Brandeis University and a former senior fellow at Brookings Institute. And we're delighted very much, Abdulmunim, that you're joining us today. And of course, Martin Indyk, no stranger to this audience. He is the Lowy Distinguished Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. He served as the Executive Vice President of the Brookings Institution. He was the U.S. Ambassador to Israel from 1993 to 1997. And from 2001, he was also the Assistant Secretary of State for the Near East. During the Clinton administration, he was also President Obama's Special Envoy for Israeli-Palestinian negotiations from 2003 to 2014. I should say that I was honored to work with Martin during this period. And he's the author of a fantastic book about 73 called The Master of the Game, all about Henry Kissinger, and I'd urge you all to read it. And our other panelists have written extensively about this period too, so please read all of their writings. I should just add on an administrative note that if you want to ask questions to our panelists, please enter them into the Zoom Q&A function below. And if you are watching this policy forum on our website or on YouTube, please feel free to email your questions to policyforum, one word, at washingtoninstitute.org. So I'm just going to say a few words to set the scene for our discussion. Rob pointed out what a seismic event this was in modern Middle Eastern history. It marked the last Arab-Israeli interstate war, the dawn of modern peacemaking, and America's emergence as the indispensable third party in peace diplomacy. In the lead up to 73, however, there were critical miscalculations on each side that influenced the trajectory of the war, and we're going to discuss that. Prior to the war, the U.S. leadership, and namely Kissinger, Nixon, and Kissinger openly talks about this, he deeply underestimated Anwar Sadat. After the demoralizing loss of 67, Sadat favored another war with Israel in the hopes of regaining the Sinai Peninsula and reviving Egypt's legacy as a leading peace power. Amid a period of détente with the U.S., Sadat was dissatisfied with the Soviet weaponry he was receiving, and he pushed out Soviet advisors from Egypt. Kissinger missed this crucial signal and also ignored the warning of Egyptian National Security Advisor Hafez Ismail during secret talks with Kissinger in the United States in February 73, and cautioned that a war with Israel would occur in the absence of diplomatic steps. On the Israeli side, Golda Meir and the defense leaders downplay the likelihood of war due to Israel's infamous conceptia, the concept that Egypt would not engage in a war that it was likely to lose because it didn't have the long-range bombing capability. Warnings of imminent attack, therefore, were ignored in favor of this conceptia. And this is considered to have deterred the IDF from ordering mobilization and contributing to Israel's heavy losses at the war's outset. The war went on for 19 days. Israel lost 2,656 soldiers. Egypt lost many, many more. Israel lost 3 times as many soldiers per capita as the U.S. did in Vietnam over the course of a decade. While Israel emerged from 73 victorious at the outskirts of Cairo and Damascus, it didn't feel like it. Though the post-war Agranat Commission, and some of you might see the movie Golda, it spared the political echelon while excoriating the IDF intel and some of its commanders. The public fury over the intel failure and the IDF's lack of preparation resulted in such staggering losses. Golda Meir was swept from power, as was her defense minister Moshe Dayan, and this accelerated the collapse of the Labor Party, the de facto one-party rule since 1948. But Sadat was also somewhat overconfident during the war. And at a key moment where there could have been a ceasefire, he ignored Ismail Fahmy, as Fahmy writes about in his memoirs. And this might have been a turning point. I'm sure we'll discuss this. It led to ultimately Israel crossing the road, crossing the canal. 20,000 men of the Egyptian Third Army was encircled without food or water, severely constraining its negotiating position, but Kissinger was able to extricate the Third Army. So however painful for all parties, the war shattered the regional order. Just 6 years after the ceasefire, Israel and Egypt would sign a peace treaty, as Rob noted, under American aegis, heralding the end of the Arab-Israel interstate war conflict. But these 19 days shattered the Middle East, and we're going to talk about that now with our panelists. And indeed, to look at these different issues of miscalculation, the role of leadership, and really the lessons learned, the legacies of this war going forward to this day, 50 years later. So I'll start on the miscalculations theme. Some of this was prior to the war, and before we get to leadership and legacy, just feel free to elaborate. But we want to know, how did the miscalculations before the war impact the war itself? Maybe I'll start with you, Martin. In your book, Master the Game, you called Kissinger's initial underestimation of Sadat a failure of imagination, was your word. Kissinger used some very tough words about himself in public remarks. So how did he miss the signals of kicking out the Soviet advisors, and how did this impact him as he we'll talk about the strategy of the war and how he wanted to use the war for a regional order, but just before the war, how did Kissinger miss it, these signals, Sadat's leadership and the fact that he kicked out the Soviet military in 72, and he didn't pick up on Hafez Ismail's in the secret talks they held in 73.
Thank you, David, and hello, everybody. Kissinger is known for his insights into the personalities of the leaders that he has met with. He just wrote a whole book about leadership. And yet he had a blind spot when it came to Sadat. I think this is partly because he had very limited exposure to Arab leaders, had never traveled in the Middle East, had met very few of them, and didn't know them. Definitely did not take Sadat seriously. He referred to him as a buffoon, as some character out of the opera Aida. That attitude, I think, was influenced by the Israeli assessment, which they shared with him, which similarly did not take him seriously, assessed that he was Nasser's successor by accident. And so through that frame, all of the steps he took were dismissed, the most important of which is the one you mentioned, the kicking out of the Soviet advisors in 1972. A year earlier or more, Kissinger had actually predicted that this would happen. It called for Arab leaders to do this. And yet when Sadat did it, he scoffed and said, what a fool, he did it for nothing. If he had come to me and asked me for something, then I would have responded, but I got it for free. So that characterized his attitude. I think that when Hafez Ismail finally got to see Kissinger and came with a far-reaching peace initiative from Sadat, Kissinger started to pay attention, got quite excited about it, as did Nixon, his boss. But then he sat down with Yitzhak Rabin and laid this out to Rabin, who was then Israel's ambassador in the United States. And Rabin, as he could so easily do, and Ephraim will back me up on this, simply dismissed it, said there's nothing new here, and reinforced the Israeli assessment that there was no need to take this seriously. I think that, combined with Kissinger's feeling that if he took it seriously, he would really have to pay a great deal of attention to this issue, when he thought that he could wait, that he could rely on the status quo with Israel reinforcing it and Dayton reinforcing it. And that with the Vietnam peace talks going on, so many other things on his plate, he just put this on the back burner until after the Israeli elections, which was supposed to take place in October of 73, when the war instead broke out.
Ephraim, to pick up on Martin and what was, about the Hafez Ismail talks, Golda Meir gets kind of the rap, while in the movie, she's very much, kind of credited for her being very decisive and her inspiration, and despite everything going terribly around her, Dayan and all this. But in the run-up to the war, she's often criticized by Israeli experts. You didn't pick up on Sadat's offer. You could have stopped this war. You could have averted it. I mean, listening to Martin, reading his book, it was clear to me the idea that she wanted to pull back, the offer to pull back from the canal. Now, in the beginning, in his public remarks, to be fair to the Israelis, it was said that these pullback had to be linked to a wider comprehensive withdrawal from everywhere, Jerusalem, everywhere. But apparently in the messaging with Hafez Ismail to Kissinger, he wasn't saying about pulling back everywhere. Do you think Israel missed an opportunity in the run-up? Who was right here? And just if you could refer to the conceptia in general. Some people think, look, this was hubris. These are Israeli generals who won the 67 war in electrifying fashion, 6 days. And yet they were so confident in their assessments. What led them to be so sure that, that their conceptia was right and that everyone listened to people like Eli Zeira, the head of Israeli intelligence?
I will answer your question, and after that, say something about Sadat himself. There was a feeling after the '67 war that we were on top of the world, that we had succeeded, and that we had been very, very successful, and that we had liberated the West Bank, and that we had captured the Golan Heights, and that strategically we were in a position which would be, I'd say, the dream of every Israeli leader. But there are two elements which were ignored. One was a technical one. There were two items in the capabilities of the Egyptians that we were aware of that we did not research properly. And that is the Segal missiles. These are anti-tank missiles that can penetrate certain types of tanks and with certain capabilities. And instead of studying what the Segal means, it was not even a matter of discussion amongst the people in the IDF. There was total ignorance about this. And when ultimately in the first week of the war, we lost 800 tanks, which was a third of the Orbat of the Israeli armor, that is one thing that we ignored and we paid a very, very heavy price for. The second, I'd say, mistake was that after the Six-Day War, there was what we called the 1,000-Day War, a war along the battle lines between Israel and Egypt, which were continuously harassed by actions and operations, both by Israel across the canal and also by the Egyptians. And we did not assess what this war had meant, because suddenly in July, I think it was, of 1970, within 24 hours, the war came to an end. And it came to an end without anybody saying why it came to an end. And we came to an end, and on the following day, the Egyptians pushed their missiles right next to the canal, and we had lost all the advantages we had gained a few weeks before that, when we downed 4 Soviet MiGs. And all this together was a failure of intelligence. But I would like to say something more about Sadat. Sadat should have been known, extremely well known, because he was active in World War II. Sadat launched an effort to carry out discussions and negotiations with the Germans, with Rommel, who was in North Africa. And he was saying to the Germans, if you promise us that once you get to Cairo, you will not stay there, but you will give us our independence, we will give you information, we will give you intelligence. And this was discovered by the British. They took Sadat, they imprisoned him, and the British ambassador in Cairo wrote a letter to London, which is in the archives of the Foreign Office, saying that this man should be put on trial and he should be executed. But the truth of the matter is that Sadat was a member of the group of officers who overturned the king of Egypt after the war. And they should have known more about this, because none other than a representative of the CIA, Miles Copeland, who is famous in the CIA for helping the Syrians to hand over the reins of the government to the military in Syria. He was there with the officers who were plotting. And Miles Copeland was together with Sadat, and he must have known Sadat extremely well. So I would say that instead of the Henry Kissinger thinking about himself, he should have turned to the CIA and said to them, do you have anything about Sadat? What do you know about him? Is there anybody who knows something about him? But this was not done. And the price paid was a very heavy price.
I remember, if I'm right, in Martin's book, or maybe I saw it elsewhere, I thought it was in Martin's book, saying that he read from a CIA assessment at the beginning that Sadat would not last 6 weeks, given all the power struggles within Egypt. And when he met with Nixon, he cited that assessment. I could be wrong, but that's what I recall. But let me move. Am I right, Martin? Am I?
Yeah, I think that, I mean, Ephraim's footnote is a very interesting one, but the CIA at the time was heavily influenced by Israeli assessments and depended on those. And I think that that's what Kissinger, at least, is referring to constantly, is that he turned to the Israelis, he turned to the CIA turned to the Israelis, came back and told him, don't take him seriously, nothing to worry about.
Abdul Munim, and thank you very much for joining us from Boston. Could you give us a sense of, the man, which we started to hear from the president's namesake, but how was it he was so underestimated in the United States? Was he as estimated before the war among Egyptians? What clues that you see in Egypt, maybe even in retrospect, I think you got to know him, but what clues do you think were missed in the U.S. that were not missed in Egypt, or were they missed in Egypt as well as the U.S. and he was only a placeholder because no one could compete with the great Nasser for charisma? How was Sadat viewed in Egypt? You're on mute. Abdul Munim. We're on mute. Can you please adjust the mic?
Now we are fine. I said I thought I will talk about the 1973 war. I was a sergeant in the war. I was in an anti-tank battalion that we crossed at October 6th at 8 o'clock in the evening after the bridges were already on. So luckily, I survived the war, but first I want to thank you, David, for inviting me. It's a good opportunity to see Rob and see Martin, who's a friend since Brookings, and also see Anwar, which I don't see him much in Egypt. So thank you very much. Let me put the discussion a little bit, trying to move it forward about strategic thinking, which usually the role of individual sometimes is minimized. I think personally, and my PhD dissertation was about the United States and the 1973 war in the Middle East. And I guess Anwar Sadat was an individual beyond everybody, above everybody. And I have a professor who predicted that when I was studying in the United States, Thomas Weigel, who told me this guy is different from the others. At the time, it was Carter, Begin, and others. He was different, and I guess he used the mismanagement and the misunderstanding and the misperception that the United States got and Israel got regarding their neighbors. I mean, if there is anything we learn from history, is that at the end, geography and demography decides conflicts. You might take a long time, but at the end, the United States got out of Afghanistan, got out of Iraq, and we have this issue. Everything was missed. I mean, nobody remembered that in the 29th of June, there was the last battle of the war of 1967. We have only a platoon still in Sinai. And the platoon fought the Israelis, stopped them from taking the east part in Sinai of Port Said. After that, there was a destruction of, the destroyer Eilat. After that, we have many things, attempts to cross and do things. So Israel missed and the United States missed. And that was in my dissertation as well, that the big problem of the United States was highly influenced by Israeli intelligence. And therefore, the idea that we, people like me, got to the army, which before 1967, usually we get employed in the government, not really go to the army. So renovation of the entire build-up of the Egyptian army by university graduates, something was missed completely from both the Israeli intelligence and get back to the genius, I will say, Anwar Sadat. As an individual, he got a view of history. And anyone who studied this issue got to study it not only from 1973, from 1970 when he came to power until he was assassinated. The idea was he made a lot of surprises, and taking off Ali Sabri and the Nasserite group from the Egyptian elite. He was changing actually all the structure that Nasser did from 1952 and his group. The idea he got some sort of strategic hibernation for himself from 1952 until 1970 when he became a president. That was an act of genius. He didn't go against history at the time, but this time he started to create history, kicking out the Russian advisors. That was another big surprise that later on, and actually the idea of dignity continued to be something very important. In my study, Sadat decided for the war, for final decision after the second meeting of Hafiz Ismail and Kissinger. Kissinger used two words. He said, well, I might have time by the end of the year to open the subject, and then Egypt has to prepare itself to make concessions politically and territorially. The word territorially made it. That's something, Sadat's line of bargaining, negotiations is to be very much soft in form. But in substance, he was very hard line. Here, the substance is territorial regarding the Egyptian national territory. He actually was also benefited very much from what has been said, that he was related to intelligence. He managed the intelligence war. He got an intelligence unit in the presidency, not in the Egyptian general mukhabarat intelligence. And from that, there was Ashraf Marwan. That's another story to talk about. He was belonging to him, to his ideas, to his command. So here the individual in history is very important in looking at the 1973 war. The second major point is actually it was a turning point from a very existential conflict. And that was a big Sadat decision. He didn't wait to consult the Arab world or the masses or the Egyptian, but that was for the benefit of everybody. Leaders project dreams and ideas that it actually enrich history, not it, impoverish it. So Sadat did what? It's not an existential, that means recognition of Israel, period. And that was 242 also means that. But aside from the legal side of it, he believed that in a regional way to remove a conflict from being existential to non-existential. And that's what we will find later on, talking about peacemaking parallel to it. Why that happened of the 1973 war role was because it gave Arabs confidence. Aside from deciding who was victorious, how many were, the casualties more or not, but after that, it should be recognized. The Arab made that decision to make war. They fought well as much as possible. Number three, they made the oil weapon a real weapon. Before that, it wasn't. It was just in the horizon, but it was made and it was very influential during Kissinger negotiations, whether in Cairo or in Damascus, because raising the oil weapon was very important. So we have also something of a tempering the Israeli behavior. Putting here some measure in Israel to the other side, which is us. I know that I'm exceeding my time, but I want to add a point regarding Kissinger. And that's here from my friend Martin. Kissinger actually made something that led to the extension of the war, the dying of people. When he went to Israel and told them, after all, the ceasefire is not, during Vietnam was not ended in time. That gave Israel 3 days, which meant an attack over Suez, which a confrontation that was bloody there. And also, in many ways, just to say it spills on Kissinger himself in how to make an agreement with Russia over a ceasefire on a certain moment. And later he goes to Israel and tell them that. So Israel made the interpretation that they have, a space of time until the 26th, which led to the nuclear DEFCON decision later on. So I guess Kissinger here got to carry the burden of that cost in the war. I have all the respect, like all people who worked on international relations, for Kissinger, but in this moment, he was neither, alhamdulillah, as we say, that didn't lead to later on to be an obstacle in the further negotiations that occurred at the time.
Martin, over to you. Thank you, Abdulmunim. Over to you, Martin. Kissinger's strategy, to what extent does he, in your view, conceive? Of course, we know when the war first breaks out, he thinks it's going to be a repeat of 67, but then he realizes this is not 67, this is something else. It seems like he wants to protect détente, while at the same time expelling Soviet influence. But to what extent does his thinking evolve during the war? Does he want to use the fluidity of the moment to shape a regional order? And I know the idea of order versus peace is a big theme in your book, but if you could just explain Kissinger as someone who, spent a lot of time with him for the book, went over all his papers during this time, to what extent do you feel his concept was fixed? To what extent did it evolve during the course of the war?
I think that Kissinger is the epitome of that phrase, never let a good crisis go to waste. And he understood very well the importance of, you said fluidity, I would use the word plasticity of the moment that the crisis created. After all, he was under pressure from Nixon to do something. He was putting everybody off until after October, but he knew that he was going to have to do something. Yet it was difficult to move the Israelis. From his point of view, he thought it impossible. Now he saw the war as an opportunity to reshape the deck, create a situation in which negotiations would favor the United States. But to do that, he had this very complex approach. He had to ensure that Israel did not lose the war, but did not win it in a way that would make it impossible for Egypt to enter into negotiations. He wanted to preserve détente, but he also wanted to make sure that the Soviet Union gained no advantage from the war. And so he was constantly juggling these apparently contradictory pressures to try to come out in a situation where the United States would be the only one who could deliver through negotiations what he would not allow the Egyptians and Syrians to achieve by war. But in that process, he had to have Israel in a malleable position. And I think that's why, to answer Abdulmunim, he decided to give them more time. I don't think he believed that they would surround the Egyptian Third Army, even though the Israeli generals told him that that's what they were going to do if they had more time. So what exactly he was thinking of is hard to tell. He doesn't talk about it, except to say he didn't expect them to go that far. Once they did, of course, he was in a perfect position to get them to open the stranglehold and show Egypt, show Sadat that he could in fact save his army by pressuring Israel. So even though it led to a confrontation, nuclear, the crisis with the Soviet Union, somehow all worked out in the end in his favor. And I think that he said many times to me that he was lucky. This was a case where he was very lucky.
He was lucky also because he had a partner in the case of Sadat. In the book of, and I want to go to Ephraim here, but in his book on leadership, he called Sadat a transcendent person, leader. Like I said, I think you can make the argument that Sadat made a key mistake during the war with the breaking down the ceasefire, refusing the U.S.-British offer, and that led to helped lead to a turning point of the U.S. Turning things more for Israel. But Ephraim, you're of the three, you were the one guy here who was actually in the decision-making loop 50 years ago, being at the Mossad station chief. How good of a read do you think Israel had of Kissinger's intention? Along the way, Martin was saying that he had this idea of kind of using the war, the plasticity, his word, fluidity, whatever word you want to use, to reshape the Middle East. How strong of a grip do you feel Israel had of its thinking? You must have been, what we read at least, Israel was shocked that Kissinger went to Moscow during the war on the ceasefire. That does not seem to have been coordinated with Israel, if I'm right. I'm just wondering how you felt Israel read Kissinger during the war. There's always the fog of battle. It's not just the battlefield, but everything surrounding it, including decision-making. I'm just wondering, from your perspective, you have a unique vantage point.
I will give you one example of what happened towards the end of the war. By the way, in parentheses, there were two wars in 1973, 2 defeats and 2 victories. The Egyptians had the first week, and they, from then on, they celebrate every year Army Day to commemorate the victory of 1973. And we don't commemorate the victory of 1973, but we ultimately celebrate the fact that by the way we acted, we contributed ourselves to, as well, to the final peace treaty and so forth. But I'd like to say one thing. When we were surrounding the army, we said that we would allow water to be delivered to the army if the Egyptians agreed to direct negotiations, army to army, and begin this move to peace. And Kissinger said, they will never agree. They will never agree. And we insisted on this. And as a result of this, on the night before something happened, Mrs. Meir sent us a letter of resignation in which she told him that she was going to accede to his demands and to allow the water to be delivered, and she would be resigning that morning in the cabinet. This arrived at midnight, American time, 7 o'clock, Israeli time. And the question was what to do with the letter. And there were 3 of us there, the ambassador, the military attaché, and myself. And I said at the moment, I said, why do we have to rush with the letter? I mean, what will come of this if we wake the secretary up at night? And we decided to delay the passage of the letter. And 2 hours later, Kissinger telephoned the ambassador and said, the impossible has happened. The Egyptians have agreed to direct negotiations. And the result of this was that we were able to do what happened, and Mrs. Meir got in touch with us and asked us what had happened. And then at one point she said, by the way, what about my letter? And we said to her, we didn't pass it on. So she said, I reprimand you for your disobedience, and I congratulate you on the results.
What a great story. I never heard that. By the way, I feel like I have to ask this question, and if you or Abdulmunim don't want to respond, I totally respect it, but I feel for a lot of our viewers, it's in their head and they want me to ask this question, but if you don't want to respond, I understand. But Ephraim, given your position at the time, Ashraf Marwan was viewed as a key figure in Israel, someone who directed, and Abdulmunim actually referred to Ashraf Marwan, who was Nasser's son-in-law and was the director, I believe, of Sadat's office. There have been books that have been written about Ashraf Marwan. There was a whole argument, it seems, between the Mossad and military intelligence about whether he was an agent, a double agent. The Mossad seemed to have been, believing he was genuine. If you don't want to respond, I respect that. But I know that the viewers of mine here are going to ask me, did you ask Ephraim Halevi about Ashraf Marwan? So I leave it to you, then I will ask Abdulmunim too, but I don't know, maybe you've said publicly or anything about it or not, but I feel I have to ask.
I'll say two things. First of all, I became aware of the Ashraf Marwan operation several years before I came to Washington. I was not privy to much of his information. I was privy to certain items that he had passed. And I followed what he was doing over a long period of time. He was an agent. He was not a double agent, despite the accusations even last week of the head of military intelligence, General Zaira. He's mistaken. Ashraf was a genuine agent, and he didn't just do it for political reasons. He was very well rewarded for what he did. So I think from that point of view, the Mossad has come out with a booklet about Ashraf Marwan. We've just published a book in Hebrew, which I wouldn't be surprised if it's not translated into English. I recommend that you read it when you see it. I think you will see, if you see the texts of some of the things that he gave us, it is inconceivable that a man of this nature would be a double agent. And it's inconceivable that the Egyptians would launch such an operation and risking so much information getting into the other side. I know of operations which are you double an agent, or as the British say, a rumble double agent. In other words, there's an agent and you recruit him, and then you convert him into a second stage, and then you go to the third stage. He was not either one, nor the two, nor three. What I do not know is who brought about his unfortunate death. I don't know who did it. I know who didn't do it. Israel certainly didn't have any hand in this. And he had a very, very noble funeral afterwards in Cairo. So I don't know why. But I will say again that as far as this particular case is concerned, I have no hesitation in telling you what I'm telling you now.
By the way, in the interview Eli Zaira gave in Yediot Achronot on Friday, he says that Marwan was so respected in the Israeli system that until he spoke, they didn't think that there was a war that was going to happen. That, I mean, he put it in a very positive way. Whatever he felt about Ashraf Marwan, he thought the Israeli political leadership had high regard for him. That was, I think, in that Yediot interview. I don't know, Abdulmunim, again, if you don't want to talk about it, I definitely understand. But I don't know, is there any conversation about Ashraf Marwan? Then I want to ask you more the macro about the legacy of the war. But since Ephraim said what he said, I think I have to give you a chance to respond.
Well, Marwan was an Egyptian agent in the middle of Israel. He used the method exactly what was done on the surprise attack. And it was the design of Sadat himself. Sadat, who designed the war, built on his knowledge that the Israelis and the Americans are very much understanding the Egyptian military capability. In the same way, when you have a guy go and knock on the Israeli, that is a brilliance of Sadat, actually, to go and knock on the Israeli embassy and saying, I want to be your spy. And that's the only way. When in most of the discussion on the books of Israel, he was really enforcing the idea about Egyptians who are really don't like their leaders and who has a problem of money. And I mean, everything. In the same time, when you read the Israeli writings on that, some of it doesn't know the system, like taking that the guy was so brilliant that he get the driver from the Israeli embassy, from the Egyptian embassy, to take him to the meeting with his Israeli partners. And here they don't know that every driver in our embassies are coming from intelligence. I mean, at the time, at least, I never been with intelligence to tell you, but that is something. The idea when he tried to convince them that the Palestinians are going to have a missile against, I think, El Al, and then the one was really going to, tell the Israelis told the Italian intelligence. But the idea about the story that Marwan and his wife carrying a missile and taking it to the plane to Italy without the total supervision of Egyptian intelligence is a totally nonsense. I mean, that is coming into Cairo airport. And after getting out of Cairo airport, we know now there was a unit within Sadat presidency, and we know who was handler of and trainer, by the way. He was one of the most brilliant people, Abdussalam Mahgoub. He was deputy on the Egyptian intelligence. And he was the one who trained him and actually supervising him and making all. So we don't get it all. And I want to exclude completely. And I, as an analyst here, I learned that one of the techniques of intelligence is to keep them guessing. I mean, if you have this balance of power, and there was always this balance of power between Egypt and Israel in terms of technology, in terms of a number of issues, and their marriage with the American huge resource intelligence, then you use all the elements of, I won't say the weak, but the less capable. Is you guess, let them guess, let them get the doubt, don't give them further information. I guess in the terms of war, you look, they ask him to go. I mean, in a time of war, and you have Ashraf Marwan, as the secretary of the president, going to London to inform the Israelis, that's something. I mean, you can underestimate the Egyptian intelligence as much as we want. And then he told them that the war will be 6 o'clock because we need 4 hours. Egypt needed 4 hours to cross. I mean, and that's what happened. The Israelis thought, they never thought that the war could start at mid-noon. I mean, 2 o'clock. I was waiting and we saw the planes and, I witnessed that moment. But to give the information, knowing it is also the day of Yom Kippur, and Diane will not know until 4 o'clock in the morning, and then the meeting of the Israeli cabinet in the morning, and then you have the idea that you might get a division. I mean, for the sake of Israel, I think they didn't have a division. But Diane, for instance, we know now, he was not for making any preemption attack. Sadat want to prevent the preemption attack. He want to complete the process of the crossing as safely as possible. And when you taking about 170,000 soldiers from the West Bank to the East Bank with casualties only 200 people, that's a miracle.
So let me ask you, Abdulmani, we're at the final round here. So I'll start with you and then I'll go to the others. Just the legacy of the war. I mean, it seemed, from war to peace, you talked about the role of Sadat. having, and we famously hear about him wanting to break the aura of invincibility of the Israelis, wanting to use the United States, famously Sadat saying America's got 99% of the cards. I'm wondering how you feel 73, you could say how it clearly led to the first peace treaty, but how else did it change Egypt?
Yeah, it changed Egypt, and I think it changed the conflict, which, as I started, from existential to non-existential. It created precedents. I mean, precedent that, now when the United Arab Emirates made the Abrahimite division, the Abrahimite accords with Israel, what they put on television. What they put on television was the memories of Camp David, the pictures of Sadat. So you created a legitimacy for peace, among Arab population in general. And it became very rich. We have this engagement agreement, we have it twice. Then we have the negotiations, the books that came out of it. I think there is a long range kind of a level of education for all of us about what's happening on that very intricate, very complex, protracted conflict. And therefore, I guess that is the message we get from the 1973 war. It was much more than a war. It was actually projection to the present time. Even I will not exclude completely when the agreement with the Saudis happened in one way or another, you will find these pictures come up. It created legitimacy to the idea that peace, and we can live with each other. And I guess Sadat played a great role in educating the Egyptians for that. And when he came back, actually have a huge reception. Yet Egypt was divided. And the divide here went against him. We have the so-called demonstration of food in 18 and 19 January 77, and then the assassination of Sadat. So that is anyway as a long road to discuss, but I guess it was a very rich event, and I mean, probably since the Second World War, in which the Allied played the role of recreating the world anew after the war. This one, it was like in an agreement. Now we come into, you just mentioned it, that, or I think Martin mentioned it, that, they expected that Kissinger expected that the Egyptians will refuse meeting with the Israeli military. I will say Sadat was waiting for it. I mean, this request, not to save, he was also in the same time mobilizing the Third Army. I mean, he was ready to fight again if that didn't work. But he was very realist, very understanding. But in the meantime, that was the beginning of start talking.
But can you just say, and very briefly, in Egypt today, and Rob asked this question to his namesake, Anwar Sadat, is Sadat remembered more by the Egyptian people for 73 or for 77 to 79 for the peace? For war or peace?
As Anwar said, 73. Yeah. As I said, it gave us, something to feel good about. And I guess also it got an appreciation of the conflict. The conflict was defined between right and wrong, between the legitimate and the illegitimate, between the rightful in terms of God and that's unrightful. This kind of dichotomies, now, no, let us, we are human beings and a better understanding. Of course, they get mad at Israeli settlements, but I think it created the base of peace. And later on, Sadat, he was the one who made it also again. I mean, if Martin wrote a great book about Kissinger, I think he should write another book about Camp David. Still, we have the chronology of Camp David, but not the psychology of Camp David, accords, and how Sadat went to Jerusalem. I mean, we are talking here about unprecedented events. Never happened like this before. A leader of a country. I was here in the United States. I was a student. And I was amazed by both what he did and what my Arab colleague did. I mean, here the guy went there. We are seeing, at the time in DeKalb, Illinois, you get a student who is coming from Egypt become a star in 24 hours when Sadat went to Jerusalem. So you have something, big event. I think the two events got to be discussed in the same way.
Okay, thank you, Abdul Munim. I'm going to go to Ephraim, then I'll give Martin the last word. But Ephraim, just, I mentioned in my intro about how 73, even though it ends with Israel at the outskirts of Cairo and Damascus, the public turns on Golda Meir and Dayan, and you sense that the Labor Party's hold on power is starting to crumble, which culminates with the 77 election of Begin, the emergence of Gush Emunim. We thought the generals were the gods, but now we are not sure of this anymore. The emergence of the settlement movement, the emergence of the Palestinian issue. A lot happens after the 73 war. What do you think are the legacies that we're missing in our understanding of the impact of the war inside Israel?
I understand your question, but I have to say something else about the process. The process did not begin and end in 1973. After 73, there was no meeting in 74 and 75. And in 76, the Mossad began an effort through the King of Morocco to try and establish a relationship with Cairo. And ultimately, Rabin, who was given a disguise, traveled in disguise to the capital of Morocco and met the Deputy Prime Minister of Egypt. And after that, there was a second visit of another person. And ultimately, the arrival of Sadat in Jerusalem was not a surprise for Israel. It happened when Begin was already prime minister, and he was on board on this. And therefore, this was due in no small measure to General Khofi, who was head of the Mossad for 8 years at that time. It was for the Israeli intelligence representative in Morocco, whose name was Porat, whose wife was a leading actress on the stage in Israel, Orna Porat. And the ultimate arrival of Sadat in Jerusalem was that he knew in advance what he would be, what would be the terms of his arrival, and also what kind of welcome he would get. So it's not just suddenly somebody got up in the morning in Cairo and said, let's do this or let's do that. There was a process here, it was an important process, and it produced the result.
By the way, did you say Rabin, when he met with King Hassan II in 76, he also met an Egyptian? Did I understand that correctly? Yes. Or because usually we refer to the Dayan Tohami of 77.
Yeah. He also visited, he also saw Tohami in 76. And,
wow, okay.
Yes.
That's a scoop. That's a scoop for me. I didn't know that.
Well, you know, there are times that you are surprised. I don't
to be clear, it was Rabin or Dayan.
No, he's saying Rabin in 76. Before Dayan in 77, also met Tohami in Morocco under the aegis of King Hassan II, if I understand you correctly.
That's right. Dayan traveled through Brussels, and I at that time was the station chief for all of Western Europe, and I was in Paris, and I came specially to Brussels to arrange for the how Dayan would be able to travel incognito to Morocco. And we arranged for a cocktail party that morning in the residence of the ambassador. And at a certain moment, Dayan was taken to a back room, and a person who resembled Dayan took over, and the representative took Dayan's wife, and they entered the car, and they traveled to the airport and flew over to America. And Dayan, who was in my hands actually at the time, was in the car of the head of intelligence in Brussels, who was a great friend of ours, and he helped us to get Dayan safely across the border into France, and from there into the aircraft, which took him to Morocco.
No, but I just want to be clear, because I don't want to make a mistake. And Martin asked too, he picked up on it, his ears perked up too. But you're saying that also Rabin in 76,
Yes.
before Dayan in 77, Rabin, when he was the prime minister of the state of Israel, also met with Touhami in Morocco, 1976, apart from the 77 Dayan Touhami meeting.
Correct. Correct.
Correct. Okay, that's it. Okay, that's a scoop. All right, let me go to. Can I go to Martin? Because Martin's been very patient. But just to talk about the legacy of 77. I mean, of the war, and Ephraim is so right, and it goes without saying, without the disengagement agreement of 1974 with Egypt and Kissinger, without the 75 Sinai II. With all the controversy, without that and with all its annexes, these were building blocks. The Sadat visit to Egypt, to Jerusalem, does not come out of the ether. It comes from a foundation that was built in the aftermath of the war. And so, Martin, I'm struck, and I assigned the conclusion, as well as other parts of your book, to my graduate students at SAIS at Johns Hopkins, but about how you look today, even to the gradualism that emerged of Kissinger as a legacy of that war. We think of shuttle diplomacy. It wasn't just shuttle diplomacy, but it was the principle that the peace could not be solved all at once, but it had to be done over time. And I just wonder, to what extent is gradualism a legacy of that war, and what does it mean for us even today, when yes, there's been progress, Israel, Egypt, Israel, Jordan, the Abraham Accords, there's talk about the Saudis now. What is the legacy of Kissinger's gradualism? What does it mean for us today?
Well, first of all, I just want to add one thing, because Sadat deserves all of the credit that he's getting here. But Golda also deserves some credit, because even though she was stubborn and Kissinger had to really wrestle her to the ground and force her to accept the idea of giving up territory, nevertheless, when she was convinced, she was capable, notwithstanding all of the turmoil that was going on in Israel at the time. She proved capable of rallying the people behind some very difficult decisions, which launched the peace process. So she deserves her due. I don't think she gets it in the right way in the movie. Kissinger's approach was one that was designed to resolve the conflict over a long period of time. He did not believe that such a long-lasting conflict could be resolved in one big step. Ironically, Sadat and even Rabin, and as I show in the book, even outside of Syria, were more ambitious than he was. And in fact, he could have made the peace between Israel and Egypt that Jimmy Carter made in his last year in office. There were indications, and Ephraim is just giving you another one, that Rabin and Sadat were ready for the big step. But it was Kissinger who said, no, that's too ambitious. We have to do slowly, one step at a time. So the disadvantage of his gradualism is, I think, clear there, that he missed the opportunity. But the advantage of gradualism was very much the case when Rabin adopted a Kissingerian approach to making peace with the Palestinians. Oslo was a step-by-step, gradual, incremental process, which put off the ultimate resolution of the conflict until both sides had a chance to build confidence and to get to know each other and trust in each other in a way that would make the compromises more compatible, more digestible for both sides. And the mistake there was in the case of Ehud Barak, a great leader, but he wanted to go and finish it all in a very Sadat-like way. But Kissinger in that case was right. Arafat was not ready, and it produced an explosion. So I think that what's important here is to realize that there are times when an incremental approach to conflict resolution makes a lot of sense because both sides or one side or the other is not ready for the ultimate compromises. But a focus only on incrementalism can miss the opportunity. And Kissinger did that before the war broke out. He did it again when Sadat and Rabin indicated that they were ready. And so it is the challenge of the statesman who can never know at the time he or she has to make the decision, can never know what the outcome would be if he or she decided the other way. Ultimately has to make the judgment. And it's sometimes correct to go incrementally and sometimes correct to go for the whole enchilada. And it's up to the statesman to calculate the risks and make the judgment.
That was very well said. I mean, I think that is the whole question, judgment. It comes down to the statesman issuing judgment, when to be transformational, when to be incremental. I think ultimately what Sadat showed in the 77 trip and beyond was that he was, as Kissinger writes in his book, a transformative leader. And it did change the Middle East, but it began with the 73 war and the debate and about its legacy and what happened before and during, after. It will endure, but I cannot imagine a better panel than that we had today. I want to thank each of you for your time and your efforts. I urge everyone to watch the rest of the series on tomorrow, Wednesday, and Thursday, part 3, on looking at that war and its legacy. So I want to thank you very much, Abdulmunim Said Ali, Ephraim Halevi, Martin Indyk, for your time and your expertise, and wish everyone else a good day. Thank you for joining us at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Thank you all.
Thank you.